Chapter 4 Monday, 16th of April, 2012.
What do you know about our brothers in the Philippines?
That had been the simple question, and Abdul Mansour had answered honestly. Very little. It had been asked at a meeting just over the Afghan border from his home in Pakistan. Abdul had told him what he knew, which was that Abu Sayyaf had some notable successes in the past, including the kidnapping for ransom of several foreign nationals, and of course the ferry bombing in 2004 which had killed over 100 people. There had been other minor incidents in recent years, but nothing that had made international headlines. Beyond that, he knew little of their current strength or future strategy, and said as much.
They are more concerned with internal and regional feuds than striking out against their oppressors, Azhar al-Asiri had told him. They need some proper leadership in order to focus their attention.
Al-Asiri had long been both Osama bin Laden's deputy and the brains behind Al-Qaeda, but had nowhere near the charisma of the man he called the Sheikh. He had been happy to let the Amir front the organisation while secretly pulling the strings from behind the scenes. In fact, it was al-Asiri who had suggested taking things to a global level. Bin Laden's initial fight had been against the presence of American soldiers on Saudi soil, but it was al-Asiri who had planted the idea of aiding fellow Muslims in their grievances, wherever they may be. There had been financial support for Abu Sayyaf in the early days, but that had dried up as their hierarchy had fragmented, splintering into separate groups.
Our aim is to unify these pockets of resistance once more and turn them into a formidable ally, but we cannot do that with money and weapons alone. I would like you to go there and do for them what you have done for me here. You will take them the weapons they need and show them how to use them. More importantly, you must get them to launch attacks against our enemies as soon as possible.
Mansour hadn't questioned the need for an immediate strike. He'd simply accepted the mission without hesitation, honoured to have been chosen for such a task.
You will not have long, al-Asiri told him. You will leave in 7 days, and I need you to return before the middle of May. I have a major offensive in mind and I want you to take part in the planning.
Following bin Laden's death the previous year, al-Asiri, in his early 50s, had taken over the reins, as had been widely anticipated by the Western world. However, they were quick to dismiss him as a lamb to bin Laden's lion, a sparrow to his eagle, and it pleased him that they had written him off so readily. So far he had done what his detractors had expected, which had been nothing whatsoever. At least, so they thought. His focus had been on building up an army of generals, men who would go into the world and train others so that one day they could launch a coordinated attack that would leave the infidels trembling at the mention of his name. One such general was Abdul Mansour, whose rise through the ranks had been meteoric. From a humble British background, he had quickly proven himself an excellent soldier, carrying out numerous raids against the occupying US and British forces in Afghanistan. His crowning moment, however, had been his attack on the stronghold of Tom Gray in England the previous year. The intention had been to prevent Gray revealing the location of a device set to kill thousands of people, and it had cost the lives of 30 young martyrs. The device had been found in time by the British authorities, but the audacity of the raid in such a short time had cemented his name in Al-Qaeda history. Mansour had come up with the idea himself. 72 hours after putting forward his proposal to the elders, he was in the middle of the battle, taking several lives, including that of Gray. Upon his return to Pakistan, he had received a hero's welcome and quickly been elevated up the ranks, going from foot soldier to tactician, from student to teacher. The recruits he trained were in awe of his achievements. He taught them that nothing was impossible if you trusted Allah with your life. Many men had passed through his hands, soaking up his courage and strength as well as his knowledge, and his exploits had come to the attention of the very highest in the organization. To his great regret, Mansour hadn't been able to meet Osama bin Laden in person. A meeting had been arranged in Abbottabad, but the US Navy SEALs struck 2 days before Mansour could be introduced to his master. That had been a personal blow, but he'd soon found that Azhar al-Asiri was a more than fitting replacement, and it was al-Asiri who had been instrumental in his successive promotions. Mansour began overseeing the training of all new recruits, and al-Asiri was impressed with the results. He was even more impressed with Abdul's suggestion of a series of coordinated strikes around the world, something which fit his global ambitions. After considering it for weeks, he convened a meeting of the highest ranks of the organization. The leaders discussed and agreed upon the proposal, and then dispatched generals to many countries to make their preparations. Azhar al-Asiri had personally chosen Abdul for what he considered the toughest assignment, which was why Mansour was now sitting on the rain-soaked deck of a banker, heading for the Philippine island of Jolo, alongside his companion Nabil. Nabil Shah was Mansour's lieutenant, an excellent soldier in his own right, and a good friend for the last few years. Although older than Mansour, Shah had no qualms about taking orders from his general, a man who had proven himself in battle time and time again. Indeed, he made it known that he thought it a privilege to serve Mansour. The arduous journey had begun with a 400-mile drive from Quetta south to the port of Karachi. It had taken a full 10 hours to reach their first destination, travelling not only on main roads but also on rough tracks, which often limited the speed to only 10 miles an hour. At the port, they had been whisked aboard a freighter and given a cramped cabin for the 17-day trip. On nearing the port of Zamboanga, Abdul, Nabil, and their cargo had been transferred onto this vessel for the final leg of the journey. The boat looked like any other banker, but boasted 2 giant Tohatsu outboard motors that could be swung into place at a moment's notice, making it capable of easily outrunning the local Navy patrols. In addition, there was a box of shoulder-launched missiles on board which would discourage, if not sink, any of the Hamilton-class cutters that might get too close. A lesser person might have taken the easier route of flying to their destination or travelling most of the way overland. However, Mansour was not only highly regarded within his own organisation, he was also known and sought throughout the world. Crossing just one border was a huge risk, so he had no hesitation in taking such a circuitous route. He'd filled his time using his 3G tablet PC to read up on Abu Sayyaf and their exploits over the years, using both the internet and files provided by al-Asiri. Known to everyone else as Abu Sayyaf, meaning bearer of the sword, they called themselves Al-Harakat al-Islamiyah, Islamic Movement, and had been founded in the early 90s when they split from the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF. Their first leader had been Abdurrahak Han Halani, a veteran of the fight against the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, and their first major attack claimed the lives of 2 American evangelists in 1991. Their attacks weren't limited to foreign nationals, as the Ipil raid in April 1995 proved. Desperate for funds, they had attacked the predominantly Christian town of Ipil in Zamboanga del Sur, looting shops and banks while firing indiscriminately at civilians. 53 people were killed in the attack, and upwards of 30, mostly women and children, were taken hostage as they retreated. In the last decade, their favoured method of attack was bombing. They had hit populated locations to cause as many casualties as possible. 21 people died when a waiting shed at Davao Airport was blown up. On Valentine's Day 2005, Abu Sayyaf hit separate targets in General Santos City, Makati, and Davao City, where they killed 8. Recent attacks had been sporadic, with only one making the international news. 11 people died that day as up to 70 members of Abu Sayyaf raked houses with gunfire and set them ablaze in a pre-dawn raid. In order to carry out these attacks, Abu Sayyaf needed weapons, and weapons cost money. In the early days, they received funding through Muhammad Hamal Khalifa, a brother-in-law of Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden had been a colleague of Hanhalani during their Afghan Mujahideen days, and had provided his personal financial support until 1995, when US authorities uncovered Khalifa's connection to Abu Sayyaf. Having cut their ties with MNLF and by association the Malaysian group Hema Islamiyah in 1991, Abu Sayyaf had foregone their access to the major al-Qaeda funding that had been channeled into the region. They stepped up their kidnapping campaign to support themselves. They had taken hostages in 1993 and 1996, but kicked it up a gear at the start of the next decade following the death of Abdurrahak Hanhalani. Instead of retaining his ideological focus, they fell into kidnapping, murder and extortion in a big way under the rule of Hanhalani's younger brother, Gaddafi. There were several abductions in 2000, starting with several teachers and students from 2 schools in Basilan. Father Roel Gallardo and 3 of the teachers were found murdered in May that year, evidence of torture on their bodies. Following that was the Sipadan kidnapping, in which 21 people were taken from a dive resort in Malaysia, with most of them being released within a few months. During that time, TV evangelist Wild Almeida and some of his Jesus Miracle Crusade prayer warriors turned up at the Abu Sayyaf camp in Holo, Sulu, to pray for the hostages. Unfortunately, they themselves became captives and were held until being rescued by the military nearly 4 months later. In 2001, one of the highest-profile kidnappings took place when 20 foreign nationals were grabbed from tourist resort Dos Palmos Beach in Palawan, including 3 Americans, Martin and Gracia Burnham and Guillermo Sobero. A fortnight later, a request was made for a Malaysian intermediary to negotiate a ransom payment, but instead they came under attack from AFP soldiers. After they managed to evade the soldiers, Sobero was taken into the jungle and beheaded, a move designed to show that Abu Sayyaf took the situation seriously, even if the Philippine government did not. It was over a year later that Martin Burnham and Ebidora Yap, a Filipino nurse, were killed when the AFP launched yet another attack. Martin's wife, Gracia, was wounded in the leg, but survived, and a subsequent investigation showed that it was AFP bullets which had been to blame for all 3 casualties. Following the botched rescue, the US Army sent 600 military advisors as part of Operation Freedom Eagle, later to come under the Enduring Freedom umbrella. In addition, the CIA sent elite paramilitary officers of the Special Activities Division, SAD. As a result, kidnappings fell to an all-time low. Mansour had soaked all of this information up during his journey, and his conclusion was that the kidnappings had probably tailed off because of the relentless pressure being applied by the US and Philippine forces, as well as a lack of continuous leadership. No matter, he thought, as he saw the island of Holo appear on the horizon. Their days of limited funds would soon be over, thanks in no small part to the cash he was bringing, as well as the promise of continued financial support for years to come. The man he was due to meet was called Abu Asaf, the current head of the Abu Sayyaf organization. Mansour had very little information about the man, except that he was in his 40s and had stepped into the vacant position after the previous leader was shot by a raiding party led by a US SAD team 4 months earlier. He was glad that he was going into the initial meeting with no preconceptions. He preferred to form his own opinions based on what he experienced, not what he had heard from others. "It has been a long journey," Nabil said, gazing out towards the horizon. "Our journey is just beginning,"
Mansour replied. "Once we arrive, it is imperative that we get them to strike as soon as possible. I will remain here while we plan the attack, but after that I will be moving on. I would like you to stay here and show them how to organize themselves against the infidels."
Shah nodded, showing no emotion. It was over an hour before they neared the shore. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't a commercial port they drew up to, but a deserted beach. A group of men waited, and as soon as the anchor went out, they waded into the water and began unloading the boxes he had brought. Mansour made a beeline for the man supervising the transfer. "Salam alaikum," the man said, and Mansour returned the greeting. "I am Jun," he said. "We go soon." It was obvious to Mansour that he wasn't much of a conversationalist, and equally apparent that there were not enough men to carry all the baggage he had brought. Jun saw this too, ordered half of the consignment to be camouflaged, and appointed 2 armed guards to watch over it. The rest of the boxes were picked up, and Jun led the way into the jungle, with Mansour and Shah following in his footsteps. The march to the camp was slow going, mainly due to the weight of the boxes, but also because they were avoiding known tracks, instead relying on Jun to cut a way through the dense vegetation with his bolo. This turned out to be the most intense part of his journey, knowing that somewhere on this small island there were close to 200 US and Filipino troops who would just love to get their hands on him, and here they were, crawling along at a snail's pace. They stopped twice on their way to the camp, the second time for over an hour as a patrol ventured close. They crouched in silence as the soldiers made camp just 30 yards away and started cooking their lunch. Mansour could see a few of the Abu Saif were itching to take them on, but Jun threw them looks which warned them to just stay quiet. Eventually the patrol moved on, and they were able to make the last mile and a half without further encounters. It was hardly recognizable as a camp. The only distinguishing feature was the number of people gathered in the small clearing, with no permanent structures to suggest they would remain here for any length of time. Abu Asaf came to greet them effusively, arms spread wide and a toothless smile on his face, then ushered them over to a log next to a small fire. 3 large fish were cooking over the flames, and a pot of rice bubbled away on a small gas stove. Mansour suddenly realized that he hadn't eaten in over 20 hours, and graciously accepted the invitation to dine. "I understand you have gifts for us," Asaf said in excellent English, the accent British. Mansour nodded and led him over to the boxes arranged at the centre of the clearing. The first one he opened was the size of a family suitcase and contained nothing but cash, over $2 million American dollars in 20s and 50s. Mansour was glad to note that Asaf's reaction was muted appreciation. There were no signs of greed on the man's face, just a look that said, "This could come in handy." The next box to be opened revealed dozens of brand new M16 rifles, still wrapped in protective wax paper.
"Rather than AK-47s, we decided to provide weapons your enemies use, because this way you can make use of any captured ammunition," Mansour said. He gestured to a couple of boxes and explained that they were full of 5.56mm rounds for the rifles, then opened the next container. "Claymore mines," he said, lifting one out to show it to Asaf. "These will help with setting up defensive perimeters and will discourage your enemies from following you," he explained when he saw the look of confusion. He smiled as he pointed to the next 3 boxes. "These will be the difference between a struggle with the AFP and driving them out of the land," he said. Releasing the catches on one of the lids, he swung it open to reveal a Dillon Aero M134 minigun. The 6-barreled weapon fired 7.62mm bullets at an astonishing 50 rounds per second, fed from a 4,400-round magazine. "In the other boxes I have grenades, C4 explosive, ammunition for the M134, and 20 single-shot RPG-27s. Bear in mind, this is just a down payment on the support we are willing to offer you."
"What are you asking in return?" Asaph asked, clearly satisfied with the gifts. Mansour placed an arm around his shoulder and led him away to a quiet spot at the edge of the clearing.
"We want only what you want, to drive the infidels from the land. To do that, you must become a force to be reckoned with, and I will show you how. The days of cowering in the jungle will soon be over for Abu Sayyaf."
"We do not cower," Asaph said harshly, aggrieved at the suggestion.
"Perhaps not. But while the AFP and the Americans wander calmly through your towns, you are sleeping up here in the hills. That is the first thing we need to change."
"How do we do that? There are barely 100 of us."
"Don't you have any men on the surrounding islands that you can call on?" Mansour asked.
"There are perhaps another 100 spread around the Sulu Sea, but they have hostages and are trying to negotiate their release."
"Bring them all here," Mansour said. "You no longer need to risk the lives of your men for mere money. We can provide all you need."
Asaph nodded, and Mansour continued with the questions.
"When was the last time you launched an attack on the infidels?"
"Attack? We can barely defend ourselves, never mind launch an attack. Besides, there are American soldiers here, elite American soldiers."
"Who have a strictly non-combatant role, as I understand," Mansour smiled. "Tell me everything you know about their base."
"I know much about their base," Asaph said, "but attacking it would only cause them to double their efforts against us. It would be counterproductive."
"Far from it, my friend. An attack on their base may indeed make them bring the fight to you, but it would also show Jemaah Islamiyah that Abu Sayyaf are no longer the poor relation they think you are. Your Indonesian brothers will sit up and take notice of you once again, and by reuniting with them, you will make the Muslim movement in the region stronger than you could ever imagine."
"They will not join with us. They refuse to even talk to us. How will this one attack change their mind?"
"It is quite simple," Mansour said. "I will act as your emissary to explain that they can join us and share the glory, as well as the support we will provide, or they can fend for themselves and we will no longer provide them with training, weapons, or funds."
"They are proud people," Asaph argued. "They will not submit to threats and intimidation."
"As are we all, brother. But any man who puts his own pride before the will of Allah is not worthy of calling himself a true believer. I will give them one chance, and one chance only. Naturally, I shall be very diplomatic in my approach."
Mansour could see that Asaph was still not convinced, but he was confident in his own ability to bring the two groups together.
"Let me worry about Jemaah Islamiyah, brother. All you need to do is help me plan the attack on the American camp."